This is going to be a very short introduction about the history of Ethics Week. John Houck was kind of the, you probably had very well. John was kind of the godfather of business ethics, and he died in 1996. And so basically, to kind of keep going what he had started, we started Ethics Week back in 1998. We normally have it the week of Valentine's Day, and I'll tell you why. This year we had to move it up because Ash Wednesday was on Wednesday of Valentine's Day, Valentine's Week. So the reason we use Valentine's Day week is that on Valentine's Day, if you love somebody, you get very explicit about it. If you don't, you got some problems. As a man who's been married 50 years, my wife has never thought of divorce. Okay? Murder has crossed her mind several times, but never divorce. Okay. So, you know, we kind of do a lot of ethics here, but we said, you know, once a year we got to get very explicit about it, and we normally do it during Valentine's Day week, but not this year. So with that short introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Brian Levy.
Ken, thanks. So this year for Ethics Week, we have a theme for the entire week, governing for the greater good, politics as public service. And the way we've divided this up is to have different speakers with different backgrounds over the course of the week at the federal, state, and local levels. And today we have John Sturm with us, and I hope you'll agree he has a wealth of experience at the federal level. He is the university's first ever Assistant Vice President of Federal and Washington Relations. He's been our man in Washington, if you will, since June of last year. Before that, he was the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Newspaper Association of America for 16 years. Prior to that, he held positions with CBS in their Washington office, NBC in their Washington office, and the Federal Communications Commission. He's a 1969 grad of the University of Notre Dame and holds a law degree from IU Bloomington, but we won't hold that against him. Please join me in welcoming John Sturm.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be back to Notre Dame. I find myself coming back here once a month now and really enjoying it as part of the part of my duties as Notre Dame's essentially first in-house lobbyist. As Brian mentioned, I've worked in Washington for about 40 years, representing NBC, CBS, and the newspaper industry. As I like to say, some unpopular causes in there. I had a short retirement before I opened the Notre Dame Washington office. I'm proud to say that I'm an alumnus here of this school. Actually, I'm a son, alumnus, parent, and now employee, so there aren't too many categories left. I'm also proud to have graduated from this business school in accounting, no less, in the dark ages. Let's put it this way, I lived my last 2 years in Walsh Hall. Our son graduated from Mendoza a couple of years ago. A few of you may remember, Brian does, Patrick Sturm, a finance major who's working in M&A work in Chicago as we speak. My other confession is that I am a Hoosier. I grew up in a small town in this state, in the southern part of this state. And for those of you who haven't been to the southern part of the state, there are only small towns there. I also confess to being a recovering lawyer, having graduated from, as Brian mentioned, IU School of Law in Bloomington. Those of us who went to law school at IU in Bloomington like to say that because there's actually another IU law school in Indianapolis. And that's the one where most of the legislators go to. But they are totally and utterly different. After a mercifully brief stint as a U.S. Army officer, and I say that the Army really was lucky that I was only in there a short time. I moved to Washington in 1972, and the President of the United States then was Richard M. Nixon. We'll get back to him a little bit later. Next, the disclaimer. What I say today are absolutely my own views, and I am fiercely bipartisan in the way I do my job. So, nothing I say today represents the views or is endorsed by the University of Notre Dame, its Board of Trustees, students, parents, faculty, staff, alumni, coaching staffs, Monogram Club members, verbal commitments, walk-ons, friends, benefactors, potential contributors, independent contractors, invitees, heirs, or assigns, including, but not limited to, lives not yet in being, and anyone else who's ever set foot on this beautiful campus. I hope I got them all. Before we get into it, a word about reality, especially on the day after a terrific Super Bowl. I candidly live on the Maryland side of the Washington, D.C. suburbs, and while most of us are Redskins fans, we were all Ravens fans last night. I've had the opportunity to do a number of speeches and presentations over the years, and I'm confident by this time tomorrow, or possibly sooner, no one here today will remember anything I had to say, even if something remotely interesting and meaningful somehow slips out of my mouth. So, recognizing this reality, please sit back, relax, and let's have an enjoyable hour. So, what are we going to talk about today? A couple of things. First, I'm going to try to describe how ethical considerations and bad actors who ignored them have caused the government to attempt to regulate itself over the years, as well as to put constraints on those who do business with the government or advocate to the government. After that, we can talk about some perhaps more interesting things like current concerns of partisanship and gridlock and why they are that way in Washington today. And we'll identify a pivotal ethical choice in that process. Last, I sincerely hope we can have some fun back and forth before the clock runs out. Since I seem to be first up this week, I sense an obligation to offer you a popular definition of ethics as well as my own shorthand version. For the record, I borrowed the following from the Markoulis Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. Ethics is a combination of two things. Ethics refers to well-founded standards of right and wrong that prescribe what humans ought to do, usually in terms of rights, obligations, benefits to society, fairness, or specific virtues. Frankly, I thought that was pretty good. Ethics also refers to the development of one's own standards, so the suggestion is that it's necessary to constantly reevaluate one's own standards to ensure they are reasonable, well-founded, and contemporary. I added that last word. There is a shorthand version, and you've probably heard it a million times. Do the right thing. To this, I add a favorite caveat of my own for you to consider. Just because it is the right thing to do just because you have the right to do it does not make it the right thing to do. Let me say that again. Just because you have the right to do it does not necessarily make it the right thing to do. I would like you to think about that a little bit, and we will revisit that as well a little later. So, how do these ethical concepts translate into the business of government? I've identified two people in recent history who are guilty, and that's an appropriate word, as we will see, of prompting the government to enact legislation that resulted in much more stringent ethical standards. They are the aforementioned Richard Nixon and one Jack D. Abramoff. Let me explain. For many years, there's been a body of prescribed ethical constraints on government employees, such as the Hatch Act that prohibits government employees from engaging in partisan political activity. Been around for a long time. But Richard Nixon and the Watergate scandal in 1973-74, during that time frame, brought many new concerns and questions and issues to center stage and how the government would confront them. The entire sordid mess surrounding Watergate caused Congress, which had become solidly Democratic because of the scandal, to act thereafter. What followed was the Ethics in Government Act of 1978, signed into law by President Jimmy Carter, if you will, a self-proclaimed ethical person. The law did many things, the most important of which is to prohibit conflicts of interest and require disclosure of any activity or relationship that even looked or approached a conflict of interest. It also put restrictions on outside employment and earnings by government employees. While this comprehensive statute significantly increased personal transparency in the government, the law also had an unintended effect. For the first time, a law provided for the appointment of independent counsels to investigate allegations involving high government officials, allegations of crimes or whatever, on the common sense theory that we should not have government employees investigating their colleagues. That in itself could be a conflict of interest. While no one really expected it at the time, in fact, this provision resulted in a series of high-profile investigations, indictments, trials, and one memorable impeachment that, it can be argued, are at the root of the extreme partisanship that we see in government today, and especially in the Congress 35 years later. Now, the nature of the process that this law put into motion was to authorize and fund investigations that in some cases went on forever and at great expense to the government, at times with very limited results. While there is no question but that a lot of good came out of the law, there are some bad examples as well, especially where it appears that partisan politics came into play. Does anyone here recall the results of the 10-year, $22 million investigation of former mayor of San Antonio and HUD Secretary Henry Cisneros for allegedly paying off his mistress? I think not. Perhaps that was ethics gone wild. Anyhow, other laws soon followed the Ethics in Government Act, such as protections for whistleblowers who report government waste, fraud, and malfeasance, as well as rules that attempt to deal with the revolving door syndrome, where people in the private sector take government jobs related to their employment for a while and then return to their former jobs in industry. Theoretically, all the wiser from their experience in government, and eventually, probably, richer from their employers thereafter. Here we have examples of government essentially attempting to regulate the behavior of its own employees in order to achieve an elevated set of standards for service in the federal government. Then, 30 years later, along came Jack Abramoff. And the fallout from his actions spurred Congress to enact a whole series of rules that essentially attempts to protect themselves from lobbyists. Remember, Congress never puts restraints on itself. It only puts burdens on others. Now, before we go too far, a defense, let's pause and recognize a fundamental truth about lobbyists in Washington and what they do. Absolutely no one on Capitol Hill or in the government or any place else in Washington, including the critics, disputes the proposition that lobbyists provide incredibly valuable and useful information that informs and improves the product of the legislative process. No one contests that. So, Jack Abramoff was a top-tier lobbyist for a couple of firms in Washington for 10 years between 1994 and 2004. He also became the center of an extensive corruption investigation that eventually led to his conviction and a total of 21 persons pleading or being found guilty on a wide range of federal crimes. The 21 included a sitting member of Congress from Ohio and several White House officials in the early part of the Bush administration. After entering guilty pleas in cases involving casino gambling, in January of 2006, Abramoff was sentenced to 6 years in the federal pen for mail fraud, conspiracy to bribe public officials, and the always present tax evasion. He served 43 months before being released in 2010. Most recently, he's been working in a pizza joint in suburban Washington. The Abramoff cases spawned new or updated versions of two sets of rules. Lobbying disclosure rules. They are rather technical in nature. They require disclosure by registered lobbyists or entities that employ lobbyists of expenses related to influencing legislation. We do that on a quarterly basis. So if I or a member of the Notre Dame faculty or staff meets with a member of Congress, their staffs, or a high official in the executive branch with the intention of influencing an existing piece of legislation, all expenses associated with this visit must be reported in full, and that becomes public information. We also must disclose on a semi-annual basis any contributions that the university makes to political candidates, and since Notre Dame does not make political contributions, this provision is not a burden to us. The second set of rules for which we can thank Mr. Abramoff are the gift rules, or more correctly, the anti-gift rules. There have been limitations on what can be given to Congress or their staffs for years, but the Abramoff affair caused them to be tightened significantly. While there are a few exceptions, thankfully, as a registered lobbyist, I cannot give members of Congress or their staffs anything. No meals, no tickets, no gifts, nothing. So, if you see a member of Congress attending a football game across the street as a guest of the university, he or she must and has paid full face value for that ticket. If he or she attends a pre or post game lunch, buffet, or reception here, they have to pay us for that too. There are virtually no exceptions to that particular part of the rule. It does go on and on. Fortunately, there is a sensible exception, affectionately known as the toothpick rule. It allows members of Congress and their staffs to attend widely attended events that pertain to their official duties and accept refreshments and light food, the kind that can be eaten with a toothpick. No forks, no knives, no big plates. We use that exception in Washington for reception. We use the exception to create receptions that expose the expertise and knowledge of key faculty members here and members of the Notre Dame staff to important government officials. On the faculty side, particularly those officials who are involved in funding research or other activities that the university is involved in. I cannot leave this area without noting, however, a remarkable contradiction for you. If you put the gift rules together with rules governing political contributions, the result is that a lobbyist, or anyone else for that matter, can have and pay for a dinner with a member of Congress as long as they hand that member of Congress a political contribution check and it occurs off of government property. But that same lobbyist cannot pay for a lunch or dinner with the same member of Congress in any other circumstance. I will leave that ethical dilemma for you. In any event, while there are certainly more examples, that's a quick overview of how Congress over the years has tried to legislate, regulate, and enforce a higher standard of ethics for those who work in or around the federal government. Now, I referred earlier to an unintended consequence of the independent counsel law. It was used in several major investigations that, in time, became extremely partisan and polarizing. Two in particular stand out. First was the Iran-Contra investigation, the Reagan-Bush administration, done by Lawrence Walsh, a Democrat, in the late 80s. The better-known example is the Whitewater investigation by independent counsel Ken Starr, a Republican. Ken is now, by the way, the president of Baylor University, in the late 90s. which led to the impeachment of President Bill Clinton and his later acquittal in the Senate. Along with some highly divisive Supreme Court confirmation hearings for the recently deceased Robert Bork in 1987, and 4 years later for Justice Clarence Thomas, these long, well-publicized investigations, and in one case, a trial in the House of Representatives, are cited by many as the basis for the extreme partisanship that we see in Washington today. However, in my humble view, that partisanship actually began because of a highly unusual election right here in Indiana. In this case, the 8th Congressional District of Indiana, down south in 1984. If you like political stories, guess what? I do. This one's pretty good. Frank McCloskey was actually a classmate of mine at IU Law School. A Democrat, Frank was elected mayor of Bloomington soon after we graduated, and later ran successfully for the U.S. House in 1982. But it was his second election that changed the House of Representatives forever. His Republican opponent in 1984 was Rick McIntyre, a lawyer and former state legislator. When they counted the votes on election night in '84, it appeared that McCloskey had won by 72 votes out of over 100,000 cast. After a required recount, required under state law, the Republican Secretary of State certified McIntyre the winner by 34 votes. Later, the Democratic-controlled House of Representatives refused to seat Rick McIntyre and ordered its own recount, this time by the House Administration Committee, which, you should not be surprised by this, was made up of 2 Democrats and 1 Republican. Want to guess who led after that recount? Yep, McCloskey, by a grand total of 4 votes, the closest margin of any U.S. congressional race ever. Each and every Democrat thereafter, except 1, voted to seat Frank McCloskey, and every Republican voted to seat Rick McIntyre. With the majority, of course, in Democratic hands, McCloskey won and was seated. My friends, at that time, it was the single most polarizing incident in the history of the U.S. House of Representatives. It also seemed to violate my caveat. While the House apparently had the right to order its own recount, is there not a serious question whether overruling a certified state election result was the right thing to do? There are a couple of postscripts to this story. When McCloskey was finally seated 6 months after the election, a little-known Republican from Georgia named Newt Gingrich led a delegation of outraged Republicans off the House floor, humming the venerable civil rights anthem, "We Shall Overcome." Frank McCloskey was a fairly dry wit. He was later quoted as saying, "You know, they had to hum that tune or otherwise fake it, because those Republicans sure didn't know the words to the song." 10 years later, the Republicans took control of the House after 40 years of Democratic control, and that member from Georgia became Speaker of the House. Unfortunately, basic civility and respect for your opponent in the House was never the same after the Bloody Eighth was decided. So why has this situation persisted in the House, and why does it appear the Senate is almost as bad? There are multiple causes for the partisanship which have led to gridlock in both houses of Congress. Let me offer you my list in no particular order. 1, the rise of single-issue pressure groups, from the Tea Party on the right to MoveOn.org on the left, often controlled by relatively few but highly motivated people. Vote against the positions of these groups too often, and the member or senator will face a primary election opponent next time around. 2, social media, which makes those single-issue groups appear much bigger and more persuasive than they really are, or perhaps should be. 3, cable news channels, radio talk shows, the 24-hour news cycle, the blogosphere, and the coincident demise newspapers. This is about the only place I can think of where choice may not be so good. With so many channels, if you will, available, people can choose to watch, listen, or read only the stuff they agree with, thereby getting little exposure to the always present other side of the argument. While I'm biased and they are sliding towards obsolescence, newspapers have traditionally tended to present more sides of more arguments. 4, rampant, blatant gerrymandering when states go through redistricting in years ending with 0. You should see some of the congressional districts that have been drawn to preserve certain seats or kill the chances of an incumbent in that district. Former Congressman from California, Phil Burton, made an art form for Democrats in California years ago, but both parties are guilty today. By the way, the well-intentioned Voting Rights Act also does not help. It has actually encouraged the cementing of purely minority seats surrounded often by safe suburban seats. How good was Burton in California? Listen to this. Until last year, when California changed its system, only one of California's 53 congressional seats had changed from one party to the other in the last 5 elections. Only one. And in a typical election today, only about 20 to 25 House seats nationwide are really up for grabs, unless there's a scandal or something like that. All the rest are pretty safe. Number 5, super PACs, 527 organizations, and the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court that allows almost unlimited political contributions to those entities. Personally, I'm a First Amendment guy, so I tend to agree with the court's treatment of the First Amendment and Citizens United. But the outcome has been relentless, mind-numbing amounts of TV advertising in battleground states, much of which takes some liberty with the truth. 6, in the House, where everything is governed by, literally, House rules, the majority party is in almost total control. Members of the minority have lots of time on their hands. In the House, having the majority trumps all. In the Senate, where they tend to make up the rules as they go along, the necessity to get 60 votes to break a filibuster means that the minority actually has some power. They can often stop or delay action, as you probably know. As a result, senators actually talk to members of the opposite party. House members don't have to, and they don't. 7, members of the uber-partisan House see a Senate seat as a promotion and are often prime candidates to move to the upper chamber. The partisanship they were taught in the House tends to go along with them to the Senate and further infects the members there. Also, since the Senate approves nominations for commissioners and heads of federal agencies, staff aides to the senators and committee staff in the Senate are often nominated by the president for those jobs. Those staffers, in turn, spread the partisan flu they caught in the Congress across town to the federal agencies and commissions. Number 8, members on both sides of the aisle in both houses are under constant scrutiny and pressure from their own party leadership to vote the party line. Vote against the leadership's wishes too many times, and a member will find themselves on the post office committee instead of energy, commerce, banking, or ways and means. Because of the tension created by these factors, magnified by the importance of control in both houses, there's been a tendency in both parties for the leaders to shield their members from having to take tough votes, votes that may be controversial back home in the next election. This, my friends, is one of the major reasons why it often appears that nothing gets done in the Congress, and why the Senate in particular is called the Bermuda Triangle for legislation. As the astute congressional observer Charlie Cook wrote recently, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, I quote, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid and House Speaker John Boehner both understand that sparing members from casting difficult votes is a part of their jobs, and in the eyes of their members, a very important part. Avoidance has become preferable to pain. Even some in the party are chomping at the bit to take on an issue, like the assault weapons ban, for example, today. They will usually end up deferring to party leaders who will sideline a vote if it endangers enough members, particularly if the party's majority in that particular chamber is on the line. Now, if you put all these forces and cross currents together, what happens is that on almost every contested vote in both houses, the member of or senator faces the following ethical dilemma. Do I vote on the basis of what I believe or what I think my constituents believe is sound public policy, perhaps good for the country? Or do I vote on the basis of what's safe for me and what will help me win the next election and keep my party in control of this house or that house? There are times when these interests intersect, which makes the choice obviously easier. But in most cases, the member has a very, very tough choice to make. And there are people out there who will never forget how that member voted on that particular sensitive issue, and they do not mind using that vote against them in the next election. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the words you've been waiting for. In conclusion, with all these forces in play, it's extremely difficult for anyone in our legislature to make what most of us would consider an ethically sound voting decision in today's Congress. It's really tough. Now, before we get to questions, there is a final postscript to that McCloskey-McIntyre story. I mentioned that there was one Democrat in the House who refused to vote the party line. He had serious problems with what his party was doing and the way they were doing it. In the end, he voted his own conscience. His name is Ron Mazzoli, a former congressman from Louisville, Kentucky. He is a graduate and honorary degree holder from the University of Notre Dame. Thank you very much. I'll do my best to answer the questions that I can handle and promise you I will talk to rest.
Questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Will the partisanship ever get better, or is it only just going to keep getting worse, in your opinion?
I think it's going to get worse for a while before it gets better. I think that, and we actually talked about this a little bit at Notre Dame. There are some efforts going on in terms of trying to get members together more early in their careers when they've just arrived socially. So that in the old days, members actually knew each other on both sides of the aisle, and they sort of liked each other, and they played basketball and went to the gym together and stuff like that. And I think there's a renewed emphasis on that. There's also a renewed emphasis on ethical considerations. So there are some courses that members sort of go through more than take, if you will, when they first get to Washington. I think some of that has to work itself out and become more effective. I think that also that, and this is inside baseball of the worst kind, but recently there was some talk about the Senate changing the filibuster rule somewhat unilaterally by the majority leader, which he believes he can do. There's a question about that. But it was actually, that collision was actually avoided by a deal that was struck between Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell, and they avoided that problem. That was a good sign. Had they changed the filibuster rule with 51 votes, change a rule that requires 60 by 51 votes, the Senate would be really in bad shape for the rest of this Congress, and I'm glad they did that. So there. And the fiscal cliff deal wasn't perfect in terms of a part of comedy, but it was C-O-M-I-T-Y. It might have been C-O-M-E-D-Y. But I think that it was a step in the right direction as well. But I do think we have to get through some of this fiscal stuff before things will get better. Yes, sir.
Do you think congressional term limits could play a role in helping to avoid partisanship?
We went through a period of time a few years ago when term limits were a big deal. And you saw a lot of members announcing that they would only be there for 1 or 2 terms, whatever. And then a lot of them recanted after they realized they were just so wonderful their constituents couldn't stand to have them not be in the Congress. But I think that too is going to come back a little bit. We also saw somebody recently who actually, Tom Coburn from Oklahoma, announced that he was actually going to do what he said he was going to do and limit himself to 2 terms. He's not running the next time. If it was up to me, if I was Thomas Jefferson as I was writing the rules, I would make House seats 4 years and limit everybody to 3 terms, so for 12 years. And I'd leave Senate seats at 6 years and limit everybody to 2. Just as much as anything, for the House of Representatives to be reelected every 2 years, you're basically raising money every day of your life. I mean, they take off from Election Day to Thanksgiving the same year. What's that? A week? 2 weeks sometimes? That's it. And then they got to go back on the fundraising circuit. If a 4-year term at least gives you some respite from that, and a 6-year term even better. But the money raising thing is just a real problem. Yes, sir.
I want to give you an opportunity to launch yourself into sort of fresh territory here on the larger forces at work on the Congress.
Remember that little line about ducking the tough one? Go ahead.
I mean, the Congress, there are lots of explanations for the lack of comedy in Congress. And part of it is that just, well, Americans, there are 300 million of us almost, and we're electing the Congress we want. So there's a bunch of different ideological camps at war with each other, and the representatives in Congress are just that. They're just representatives. I'd say most of those people are representing what their constituents wanted to do.
I think you're probably right. I wouldn't disagree with that. And I think that, and the numbers sort of bear that out. I mean, if you look at, I think that this is roughly, well over 130 of the 230 or so Republicans in the House right now are from seats that are pretty solidly red seats, red state seats. And there's, I don't know what the numbers are on the Democratic side, but your point is well taken. Many of the members in Congress reflect exactly the way their constituents expect them to vote. And here's not necessarily immigration reform, which is coming, is going to play out in a certain way. I don't know how it's going to play out, and I think there's more well-intentioned people out there now than there was a few years ago. But recognize that probably 150, maybe more seats in the House, both Republicans and Democrats, probably more Republicans than Democrats. They don't have any minorities in their district. They don't have Hispanics in their district in any meaningful number. They don't have an Asian population that they have to work, of any size. I mean, are they really? I mean, what are they going to do on immigration reform? In some ways, other than the sort of the right and the wrong kind of question, it doesn't affect them. So that's why you're going to see them. You're going to see members from Arizona, Nevada, and Texas, and New Jersey, and California. And states like Florida and states like that, they're going to be really involved in immigration reform. But don't expect a senator from New Hampshire, unless he or she happens to have sort of a special interest in it, be involved in that. It just doesn't make any sense.
But that gives them the opportunity to swing this. Those 150 people that don't really care about it, those are those are votes. You could say that's how civil rights legislation passed, because eventually senators from Idaho signed off on it and said, okay, I mean, they're 10 black people in Idaho, but they went along with civil rights.
Yeah, you can argue both whether
Yeah.
it doesn't affect them, which gives them the ability to vote any way they want. So, you know, agreed. But that's going to be an issue it will be very interesting to see how it plays out from a political standpoint. The gun issue too is very difficult, and I mean, everybody looks at the House and says, okay, the assault weapons ban can't get through the Republican controlled House. Well, let me tell you something else. I don't think an assault weapons ban can get through the Democratic controlled Senate because of Democrats, not Republicans this time around. There are a lot of pro-gun senators, or there are senators, Democrats from more or less red states, like Joe Manchin in West Virginia, Mark Begich in Alaska, Mark Pryor is a Democratic senator from Arkansas. I think Mitt Romney won Arkansas by 24 points. Do you think he's going to vote for an assault weapons ban? I don't think so. So it goes on. I mean, Mary Landrieu in Louisiana, that's another state that was won by the Republicans easily in the last election. Is she going to vote for an assault weapons ban? I don't think so. Even though New Orleans is a tough town. So, again, it really goes back to this question that I tried to pose about, you know, you want to do the right thing, but you also don't want to commit political suicide in the process. Frankly, I think that if you go back to the fiscal deal in 2011, when John Boehner and the president almost cut the big deal, I think Boehner was prepared to sacrifice himself for the for the big deal. I actually believe that. I actually know him a little bit. I think he's a fairly straightforward guy. He's a Midwestern Main Street Republican. I think he's well-heeled, and he doesn't need to be in the Congress, and I think he was prepared to go down and cut the big deal. And frankly, in some ways, I think we need more of them that will agree to do that. That's a personal opinion. Yes, ma'am.
My basic question, and I'm sorry that I was late, so maybe it's been discussed before, is exactly where the line is between the federal government and state government and judiciary. Because it seems right now that the states can pass laws and a federal judge comes in and overturns it.
Yeah, I think that you get into some territory that I don't feel overly comfortable in. But I will say, you know, our constitutional scheme suggests that the powers that go to the federal government are reserved specifically to the federal government, and all the other areas that are not specifically reserved to the federal government are the powers of the state. I mean, that's sort of like the fundamental thing. But and then you get into questions which I am frankly unfamiliar with, as to who is going to how they're going to interpret state law, state judges and federal judges. It gets very difficult. But I guess at the end of the day, I do trust the judiciary that will sort those things out the right way in 90% of the cases.
Question. We read on Friday that there's an opt-out of contraception rule proposed. I took the headline as potentially a good development in that area under Obamacare.
Yes, we think so. The university has not really released a public position on that. Let me back up and say procedurally what had happened, even after the flack hit, sort of hit the fan. After the first announcement, a year or so ago, they tried to fix it. That didn't really work, and they said they would try to fix it again. And so now the HHS has released a notice of proposed rulemaking, where they're made a series of proposals that might fix the situation. And that there's a public comment period, and I know Notre Dame their lawyers are looking at that and trying to figure out what makes the most sense, and whether indeed this is this proposal makes sense for this university. I will say this: I read the press release from HHS, and Notre Dame is a self-insured place, and it suggested that there would be a way for people to get contraceptives at no cost to the recipient or the university. And I wondered who was going to pay for that. I mean, Santa Claus. I don't know, but the details are to come. But it's something that has to play itself through. And in fact, most of the Notre Dame lawsuit and a lot of the other lawsuits, not all of them, but a lot of the other lawsuits were essentially either dismissed or put on hold until this proceeding and rulemaking proceeding plays itself out.
And John, as a registered lobbyist, how do you inform and improve the congressional process? What are some of the things you do on a day-to-day basis?
What I try to do is assist the members of Congress and their staffs and the committee staffs with information that might be as useful to them, either at their request or at our offer, in dealing with higher education issues, tax issues that affect the university. We certainly do a lot of work with agency people on trying to familiarize them with Notre Dame's strengths, whether it be nuclear propulsion or nanoscience or something like that, that might be eligible for federal funding. We get about $70 million in federal grants and funds per year for various programs and projects at Notre Dame. The university then itself invests probably almost that much itself. So that's, as Father Jenkins has said a number of times, you want to be a great research university. You don't become a great research university unless you get a lot of this stuff funded. It comes down, and I work with some consultants who are expert on that, and we try to move that process along. Give you an example, and this is probably an unfair example because, to some extent, because universities with medical centers, hospitals, get a lot of money that we don't even compete for. But University of Michigan probably gets $800 or $900 million a year. So we're still, put it this way, we got a long way to go. Yes, sir.
Representing an institution that has a clearly religious agenda in terms of influencing government, it's supposed to be non-secular. How do you balance trying to represent what the university stands for without pushing for legislating religious beliefs?
It's a good question and a tough one to answer. I think the advantage that this university has is its Catholic nature is well known, and it's respected by people that you're dealing with. And frankly, it is not something that is really mentioned a whole lot. The people at the receiving end of the information, they know that you're a Catholic school, and maybe occasionally, the notion of doing right for others enters into your conversation. But for the most part, it's not something that comes up all that often, because it's very rare for us to have to, if you will, weigh in on an issue, a governmental issue that has some relationship to Catholic faith or religion. It just doesn't happen. The HHS thing is the closest thing in a long time. And I think I've always felt that was strictly a religious freedom issue. And I'm sort of proud, I'm very proud of Notre Dame for standing up on that issue. And I think a lot of other people are too. And they've also looked around, frankly, at some other universities that claim to be Catholic, and they haven't come to the plate.
Well, maybe that's a good way to end it. Thanks so much to John.